At Thanksgiving, my older brother raised his glass to mock me for still being single. I looked at him, took a sip of my wine, and said, "I am married." The room froze as I pulled out my certified marriage license, followed by the exact proof that he had hidden every single wedding invitation I sent to our family. Before I tell you how I dismantled his financial existence before the pie was served, let me know where you are watching from in the comments below. Hit like and subscribe if you have ever had to outsmart a toxic sibling who tried to bury your happiness. Growing up in Connecticut, our sprawling colonial estate projected an image of flawless prestige. Inside it was a tactical chessboard where affection was a currency used to buy obedience. I am Vivian. I am 32 years old, and I work as a director of mergers and acquisitions in Manhattan. I spend my days evaluating corporate leverage and executing hostile takeovers. I learned those skills navigating my own dining room. We sat around the long mahogany table. The crystal glasses gleamed under the warm light of the chandelier. The scent of roasted turkey and sage filled the air. Preston, my older brother, pushed his chair back and stood up. He fancies himself the golden heir despite running a tech startup that burns cash faster than it generates revenue. He raised his wine glass, tapping the rim with a silver fork to command the attention of the room. He bypassed a traditional toast of gratitude. Instead, he centered his speech on me. He offered a condescending smile, looking down at me from his position of assumed authority. He told the gathered relatives that they should all raise a glass to Vivian, the perpetual spinster. He framed my corporate success as a tragic coping mechanism, claiming I spent 80 hours a week in a boardroom to numb the pain of an empty apartment. He patted my shoulder, offering fake pity, declaring that perhaps next year I would finally find a man willing to tolerate my cold demeanor. He waited for the family to chuckle, soaking in his manufactured superiority. I did not shrink in my chair. I did not offer a defensive argument. I reached into my leather handbag resting near my feet. I retrieved a stiff piece of embossed paper and placed it flat on the polished wood, pushing it toward the center of the table. I announced that I did not need his pity because I have been legally married for 14 months. The forced laughter died instantly. The silence in the room grew heavy. Caroline, our mother, dropped her linen napkin onto her lap. Her obsession with social status overrode her initial shock. Her face flushed a deep shade of red as she demanded to know why she was excluded from the most important social event of her daughter's life. She accused me of deliberate cruelty, asking how I could humiliate the family by keeping a secret of that magnitude. I did not raise my voice. I reached back into my bag and pulled out a small velvet box. I opened the lid and tipped it over the table. 50 pristine sealed wedding invitations and RSVP cards spilled across the wood, scattering over the table runner. I informed Caroline that I mailed an invitation to every single member of the family sitting in this room over a year ago. Preston scoffed, his face tightening. He claimed the Postal Service lost them, calling it a pathetic lie to cover my tracks. I maintained a steady gaze. I withdrew a clipped stack of United States Postal Service tracking receipts and slid them across the table. The documents glided over the mahogany and stopped inches from his plate. The digital logs displayed one specific, undeniable detail. The delivery confirmations bore Preston's signature. He had illegally intercepted my mail at the local post office to ensure my marriage remained a secret. The dining room descended into a chaotic theater of denial. Preston stared at the United States Postal Service tracking receipts resting near his porcelain plate. The ink on the thermal paper documented his exact signature, tracking the interception of 50 envelopes. The undeniable proof of his interference lay under the glow of the chandelier. He did not confess. He fell back on the defense mechanism he utilized since childhood. He tried to laugh it off. His laughter sounded hollow, echoing awkwardly off the colonial walls. He picked up one of the tracking slips, waving it in the air like a trivial piece of confetti. He projected a forced, casual smile, attempting to shrink the magnitude of his actions into a harmless, practical joke. He told our mother he was just protecting his younger sister. He claimed he screened the mail to shield me from opportunistic men, framing the interception of federal mail as a twisted act of sibling loyalty. He waited for the tension in the room to break, expecting our parents to embrace the excuse and move past the uncomfortable moment. I maintained a cold, evaluating stare. I did not blink. I let his fabricated laughter die in the suffocating silence of the room. When a hostile target attempts to minimize their actions, you do not argue with their narrative. You dismantle their motive using empirical data. I leaned forward, resting my forearms against the edge of the mahogany table. I did not care about a ruined wedding invitation. This was never about a stolen RSVP card or a sibling prank. I directed my gaze away from my mother and locked eyes with my brother. Our late grandfather built his fortune in commercial shipping. I began keeping my voice level and resonant. He understood the dangers of inherited wealth. When he drafted the generational trust fund, he embedded strict stipulations regarding the distribution of capital. He divided the principal into equal halves for his two grandchildren. But he mandated that I would only gain full, unencumbered control of my 50% share upon the legal registration of a marriage. Until that milestone occurred, the estate named the eldest sibling as the interim administrator of the undivided trust. Preston dropped the tracking slip. His forced smile vanished, replaced by a rigid, pale mask. He knew exactly where I was taking the conversation. By keeping me single in the eyes of this family and the estate lawyers, I explained, parsing out the exact architecture of his theft. You maintained unilateral control over the entire principal. You operated as the sole fiduciary. You possessed the authority to authorize withdrawals, allocate investments, and funnel cash without requiring my countersignature. Our parents watched the exchange, their expressions shifting from confusion to creeping horror. They viewed Preston as the visionary entrepreneur of the family. He operated a tech startup based in Silicon Valley, promising revolutionary logistical software. He drove imported sports cars and wore bespoke suits. They never questioned his revenue streams. I work in corporate acquisitions, Preston, I stated, dismantling his facade piece by piece. I spend my days auditing shell companies and evaluating burn rates. Your logistical software never secured a secondary round of venture funding. Your corporate lease is delinquent. Your payroll relies on phantom revenue. Your startup is a fiscal black hole. I pointed to the tracking receipts still resting on the table. You did not intercept my wedding invitations to protect me. I revealed, delivering the calculated truth. You hid my marriage because the moment I tied the knot, the trust would bifurcate. My half of the capital would transfer into my exclusive control, and your administrative access would evaporate. You needed me to remain a perpetual spinster because you were using my inheritance as a personal slush fund to keep your failing company afloat. You stole my wedding to fund your delusion. The air in the dining room turned frigid. Caroline looked at her golden son, her jaw slack, waiting for a denial that never came. Preston gripped the edge of the table. The knuckles on his hands turned white. He opened his mouth, searching for a legal loophole or a plausible defense. Do not bother calculating a defense, I advised, cutting off his silent panic. I spent yesterday morning sitting in the executive boardroom of the estate attorneys downtown. I handed the senior partner my certified marriage license. I provided them with a comprehensive forensic audit of the trust withdrawals over the past 14 months. The legal team reviewed the documentation. They identified the unauthorized capital transfers routed directly into your corporate holding accounts. Preston swallowed hard. A bead of sweat formed at his temple, rolling down the side of his face. The estate lawyers initiated a total fiduciary freeze on the trust at 4:00 yesterday afternoon. I informed the table. The accounts are locked, the routing numbers are suspended. The attorneys are currently drafting a petition for criminal embezzlement. You are locked out of the vault, Preston. He stared at me, his chest heaving. The realization that his financial lifeline was severed 24 hours ago without his knowledge paralyzed his mind. He operated under the assumption of his own supremacy, blind to the execution I orchestrated behind his back. Before he could formulate a response, a sharp melodic chime echoed through the foyer. The doorbell rang. The mundane sound shattered the heavy tension in the dining room. Caroline flinched, startled by the sudden interruption. The timing was impeccable. The holiday feast was not cooked by our mother. The pristine roasted turkey, the artisanal side dishes, and the imported wines were provided by a premium private catering company. The staff had finished setting up the dining room an hour prior and were currently waiting in the kitchen for their scheduled departure. A uniformed catering manager walked through the swinging doors carrying a sleek black leather folio. He approached the head of the table, offering a polite, practiced smile, oblivious to the financial slaughter that just occurred. "Excuse the interruption," the manager said, bowing his head slightly. "The service is complete and my team is ready to depart. I just need to process the final invoice for the evening." Preston saw an opportunity to salvage a fraction of his dignity. He needed to prove to our parents that he still possessed leverage, that he was still the wealthy entrepreneur capable of handling premium expenses. He stood up, squaring his shoulders, wiping the sweat from his temple. "I will handle the bill," Preston announced, his voice regaining a shred of its former arrogance. He reached into the inner pocket of his tailored jacket. He retrieved a heavy metal platinum credit card. The card bore the insignia of a high-tier wealth management bank, an account directly tethered to the generational trust fund he had been draining. He held the metal card out, a physical manifestation of his supposed superiority. The catering manager produced a portable digital terminal from the leather folio. He held the device forward. Preston inserted the platinum card into the chip reader. He offered a smug glance across the table, silently attempting to prove my forensic audit was a bluff. He waited for the familiar beep of a seamless transaction. The portable terminal processed the request. The small screen displayed a loading icon communicating with the banking network. The room remained dead silent, the only sound the faint mechanical whir of the terminal. Then the device emitted a harsh, discordant tone. The small screen flashed a bright, undeniable red. The catering manager frowned, looking down at the display. He pulled the card out and inspected the chip, assuming a simple read error. "My apologies, sir," the manager said, his polite tone faltering slightly. "The network returned a decline code. It says the account is frozen. Let me try running it one more time." He inserted the card again. The terminal communicated with the bank. The result was instantaneous. The discordant tone chimed a second time, louder in the quiet room. The red light illuminated the faces of the family. Declined. Preston stood frozen. He stared at the red screen, the visual confirmation of his ruin glaring back at him. The total fiduciary freeze I initiated yesterday had radiated through his entire fiscal network. The estate attorneys did not just lock the vault, they terminated his associated credit lines. The golden son, the arrogant tech founder who mocked my relationship status, could not even afford to pay for the roasted turkey sitting on the table. His sudden, inescapable insolvency was exposed under the bright lights of the chandelier for the entire room to witness. The red light on the portable digital terminal cast a harsh glow across the mahogany dining table. Preston snatched the platinum card from the chip reader. His fingers fumbled the heavy metal, scraping against the plastic casing of the device. He refused to accept the reality displayed on the screen. He turned his attention to the catering manager, projecting a volatile mixture of fake confidence and rising panic. He blamed the wealth management bank. He claimed the fraud department placed a temporary security hold on the account due to the high volume of holiday spending. He ordered the manager to input the routing numbers manually, insisting the capital was readily available. The catering manager did not flinch. Working for elite clientele in Connecticut requires a high tolerance for manufactured outrage. The manager maintained a polite professional posture. He informed Preston that manual overrides required a direct authorization code from the issuing bank, a code Preston could not produce. The terminal did not indicate a simple security flag. It indicated a hard freeze on all associated credit lines. The transaction was dead. Caroline watched her golden son struggle with the catering staff. Her face paled. The illusion of his boundless tech wealth fractured right in front of her. She reached for her own designer purse, intending to offer her credit card to smooth over the humiliating ordeal. But Richard placed a heavy hand on her wrist, stopping her. The patriarch of the family finally processed my earlier statement regarding the generational trust fund. If the estate attorneys locked the primary accounts, Richard knew their own secondary access might be compromised. The parents sat in stunned silence, watching Preston unravel. Vanessa did not sit in stunned silence. Preston's African-American wife sat 2 chairs down from him. She wore a tailored emerald green dress, projecting the effortless sophistication that made her a formidable force in the corporate world. Vanessa worked as a senior public relations executive in Manhattan. Her daily routine involved managing catastrophic media blowouts, mitigating executive scandals, and controlling the narrative during hostile corporate takeovers. She survived in that cutthroat environment by possessing a razor-sharp intellect and an uncanny ability to read the shifting currents of a room. She observed her husband. She bypassed his loud excuses and focused on his physiological responses. She noted the rapid pulse visible at the base of his neck. She saw the light sheen of sweat forming on his forehead. She registered the slight tremor in his hands as he shoved the useless platinum card back into his tailored jacket. In her line of work, those were not the symptoms of a wealthy man experiencing a minor banking error. Those were the physical manifestations of systemic, inescapable ruin. Vanessa recognized the power dynamic in the dining room had inverted. She did not engage in the shouting match with the catering manager. She pushed her chair back, the wooden legs scraping softly against the woven rug. She stood up, picked up her smartphone from the table, and walked away from the chaos. She stepped out of the dining room and entered the quiet, dimly lit hallway leading to the study. She needed raw data, not fabricated excuses. She raised the smartphone, the screen illuminating her focused expression. She authenticated her identity using facial recognition and opened the encrypted application for their joint financial portal. She bypassed the standard checking and savings interfaces. She knew those numbers were irrelevant if the trust fund was frozen. She navigated deep into the architecture of their marital assets, searching for the structural foundation of their wealth. She tapped the tab designated for their property holdings. Their primary residence was a sprawling modern estate located in Westchester County. It was a property they purchased 3 years ago, a physical symbol of their supposed success. Vanessa expected to see the standard primary mortgage balance. She expected to calculate how many months of runway they possessed before the bank issued a default notice. The digital ledger loaded. The screen rendered a catastrophic reality. Vanessa stopped walking. She leaned against the hallway wall, her eyes scanning the dense financial data. A new document sat in the property file. It was a mezzanine debt instrument. Preston did not just siphon my inheritance to feed his failing software company. When his startup continued to bleed cash and the trust fund distributions proved insufficient, he sought alternative unregulated liquidity. He secretly leveraged the roof over their heads. He secured a high-yield bridge loan extracting 80% of the underlying equity from the Westchester estate. The interest rate attached to the loan was predatory, designed specifically for desperate borrowers, unable to pass traditional underwriting standards. The principal balance was a staggering 7-figure sum. Vanessa zoomed in on the digital contract, searching for the authorization signatures. The state required both spouses to consent to a secondary lien on a primary marital residence. She found the signature page. Her name was printed in flawless digital ink. Preston had forged her consent. He bypassed the legal statutes, fabricated her electronic signature, and handed the deed of their home to a shadow lender to cover his corporate tracks before his annual board audit. He gambled her sanctuary to hide his failure. She absorbed the betrayal. She did not weep. She did not drop the phone or scream his name. Women who control international corporate narratives do not waste energy on hysterics. They execute damage control. They identify the threat and neutralize it. Vanessa locked the screen of her phone. She pushed herself off the wall, her posture rigid, her expression transforming into something cold and lethal. She turned around and walked back toward the dining room. Her heels struck the hardwood floor with a steady metronomic rhythm. The sound cut through Preston's ongoing argument with the catering manager. The men stopped talking as Vanessa entered the room. The ambient tension spiked. Preston looked at his wife, attempting to offer a reassuring, patronizing smile. He opened his mouth, preparing to tell her that the banking issue was resolved and she had nothing to worry about. Vanessa did not let him speak. She walked directly up to him. She placed her smartphone flat on the mahogany table, resting it right next to the postal receipts proving his mail theft. She tapped the dark screen, waking the device, leaving the digital loan contract visible for him to read. Preston looked down at the screen. The patronizing smile melted off his face. His skin turned a pale, sickly gray. The air rushed out of his lungs in a hollow wheeze. "You forged my signature," Vanessa stated. Her voice was quiet, devoid of any warmth, carrying the unyielding weight of an executioner reading a verdict. "You leveraged our home. You took out a secondary mortgage behind my back to fund a company that produces zero revenue." Caroline gasped, pressing a hand to her chest. Richard stood up from his chair, his eyes darting between his son and his daughter-in-law, unable to comprehend the sheer scale of the financial deception. "I can fix it," Preston stammered, his hands hovering over the phone, afraid to touch the glass. "It was a temporary bridge loan. I just needed enough capital to float the payroll until the next funding round clears. I was going to pay it back before you ever noticed." Vanessa tilted her head, observing him with pure disgust. "You cannot pay for the roasted turkey sitting on this table," she countered. "Your trust fund is frozen. Your credit lines are dead. You are insolvent. And the firm holding this note does not grant extensions to fraudulent borrowers." She reached down and pointed a manicured finger at the bold typography centered at the top of the digital contract. She read the name of the predatory lending agency out loud, ensuring every person in the room heard the identity of the entity that now owned their home. "The debt belongs to Sterling Mezzanine Partners," Vanessa announced. The name hung in the quiet dining room. Preston stared at the table, a defeated, cornered animal. Richard and Caroline looked at each other in horrified silence. I remained seated at the end of the table. I picked up my crystal wine glass, the dark red liquid catching the light of the chandelier. I took a slow, deliberate sip. I lowered the glass, resting it on the polished wood. A cold, genuine smile formed on my lips. Vanessa noticed my reaction. She shifted her gaze toward me, her sharp intellect working to connect the final dots of the evening. "Sterling Mezzanine Partners is a highly aggressive private equity firm based in the financial district," I explained, my voice cutting through the heavy silence. They specialize in distressed assets and high-risk corporate debt. They operate with absolute ruthless efficiency. They do not negotiate. They foreclose. Preston looked up at me, his eyes wide, confused as to why I possessed intimate knowledge of his shadow lender. I promised to share the details of my marriage tonight. I continued leaning back in my chair. I did not marry a random corporate drone. I married a man who understands the architecture of leverage just as well as I do. I looked directly at my brother, watching the last shreds of his arrogance evaporate. My husband is the chief executive officer of Sterling Mezzanine Partners, I revealed. The room went entirely still. The catering manager quietly took a step backward, fading into the shadows of the doorway. When your loan application crossed his desk 3 weeks ago, I explained, detailing the exact nature of the trap. He recognized the address. He recognized the forged digital signature belonging to his sister-in-law. He did not reject the application. He approved the transfer. He secured the lien against your property. I tapped my fingernail against the rim of my wine glass. Which means you do not owe money to a faceless corporation. Preston, I concluded, your debt sits on my husband's desk, which means by proxy I am your primary creditor, and I intend to collect every single cent. The revelation regarding the true identity of his shadow lender paralyzed the dining room. Preston stared at the digital contract illuminated on the screen of his wife's phone. The realization that he handed the deed of his home directly to my husband stripped away the last remaining layers of his arrogance. He sank slowly into his dining chair. His expensive tailored suit seemed to hang loosely on his frame. He looked like a hollow shell of the visionary entrepreneur he spent years pretending to be. The catering manager, sensing the lethal shift in the atmosphere, quietly stepped backward and vanished through the swinging kitchen doors, leaving the family to navigate the impending wreckage alone. Vanessa did not offer her husband a single word of comfort. The public relations executive took a deliberate step away from his chair, physically distancing herself from the liability he now represented. She crossed her arms, her sharp eyes evaluating the room, calculating her own exit strategy. Richard and Caroline remained seated for only a fraction of a second before the parental instinct kicked in. They did not look at Preston with disgust. They did not reprimand him for committing felony fraud or stealing my inheritance. In their distorted suburban reality, Preston was the designated successor to the family name. The prospect of their golden son facing a federal indictment and a lengthy prison sentence was an unacceptable outcome. They viewed my survival as an inconvenience and my retaliation as an unprovoked attack on their legacy. Richard pushed his chair back. The heavy wooden legs scraped loudly against the woven rug. The patriarch stood up, adjusting the collar of his dress shirt, attempting to resurrect his fading authority. He offered a sharp nod to Caroline. The matriarch understood the silent command immediately. They needed to neutralize the threat I posed. They needed to force a settlement before the estate attorneys drafted the criminal embezzlement petition. I recognized the tactical shift. I did not want to conduct a hostile negotiation over a ruined Thanksgiving feast. I picked up my crystal wine glass and stepped away from the dining table. I walked at a measured pace into the adjoining living room, my heels clicking softly against the hardwood floor. I stopped near the large stone fireplace, turning around to face the room. I allowed my parents to follow me. I allowed them to corner me against the hearth. Providing hostile actors with a false sense of physical superiority often encourages them to reveal their true desperation. Richard stopped a few feet away from me. He planted his leather shoes firmly on the floorboards, crossing his arms over his chest to project dominance. Caroline flanked him, her face a rigid mask of maternal disappointment and calculated malice. You think you hold the winning hand because you married a private equity executive, Richard began, his voice dropping into a low, threatening register. You think locking the estate vault and buying up his debt gives you the right to dismantle your own brother. You are letting your emotions dictate your business strategy, Vivian, and that is a fatal error. I took a slow sip of my wine, offering zero verbal response. I let the silence hang in the air, forcing him to fill the void with his extortion plot. Richard leaned forward, relying on the intimidation tactics he utilized for decades in country club locker rooms and suburban board meetings. He outlined his counteroffensive with chilling precision. I have spent 30 years building a network of influence across this state, Richard stated, his tone laced with arrogant certainty. I share a golf cart every Sunday with men who sit on the executive boards of major financial publications in Manhattan. I play tennis with corporate journalists. I know exactly how fragile a private equity firm's reputation is in the current market. Institutional investors detest bad optics. They flee at the first sign of a scandal. He outlined his intent to fabricate a media narrative designed to destroy my husband. If you do not call the estate attorneys right now and unfreeze the generational trust, Richard threatened. "I will make a few phone calls. I will leak a story to the financial press. I will paint Sterling Mezzanine Partners as a predatory lending syndicate that specifically targets vulnerable suburban families. I will claim your husband orchestrated a hostile takeover of his own brother-in-law using deceptive contracts. A fabricated scandal like that will trigger an immediate inquiry from the Securities and Exchange Commission. It will tie your husband up in endless litigation. His investors will pull their capital. His firm will bleed out in a matter of weeks." Richard paused, letting the weight of his threat settle over the quiet living room. He offered his demands under the guise of a compromise. "You will unlock the trust fund tonight," Richard ordered. "You will sign a legal waiver forgiving the secondary mortgage on his home. You will walk away from this delusion of revenge, and in exchange I will keep your husband's name out of the headlines. You will protect this family or I will burn your new life to the ground." Caroline stepped forward, eager to deliver her own designated punishment. She operated in the currency of social standing and elite aesthetics. "And if you refuse your father," Caroline added, her voice cold and sharp, "I will ensure you are permanently erased from this family. I will publicly disown you. I will inform every member of the country club, every charity board, and every extended relative that you suffered a severe psychiatric break. I will ensure you never receive another invitation, another holiday greeting, or another dime of our remaining wealth. You will be a ghost in the circles you grew up in." They stood shoulder to shoulder, a unified front of suburban extortion. They believed their combined threats of corporate sabotage and social execution would force my compliance. They expected me to lower my gaze, apologize for overstepping, and surrender my leverage to save my husband. I looked at my father. I looked at my mother. I did not display a single flicker of fear, anger, or sadness. In the realm of high-stakes corporate warfare, emotional reactions are liabilities. I processed their threats through a filter of cold logic. Richard sounded confident, but the rigid posture of his shoulders and the slight tremor in his jaw betrayed a hidden, suffocating panic. He was not negotiating from a position of strength. He was a drowning man threatening to splash water on the person standing on the shore. I did not argue the legal merits of his threatened smear campaign. I did not defend my husband. I did not mourn the loss of my mother's affection. I simply lowered my wine glass and raised my left wrist. I wore a sleek digital smartwatch. The screen illuminated under my touch. The colonial estate was equipped with a premium integrated surround sound audio system. The speakers were embedded seamlessly into the ceiling architecture of the living room, designed to play classical music during elite holiday gatherings. I tapped the glass face of my watch twice. The digital interface synced with the central audio receiver. A soft chime echoed from the ceiling, indicating the Bluetooth connection was active and locked. "You assume you possess the high ground," I said, my voice cutting through the tense atmosphere with clinical detachment. "You assume your pristine suburban reputation offers you leverage, but you fail to realize that I audit everything." I tapped the play button on my screen. The living room filled with the sound of a recorded voicemail. The audio quality was pristine, captured directly from the secure corporate voicemail servers at Sterling Mezzanine Partners. A voice echoed from the surround sound speakers. It was not a confident, commanding tone. It was slurred, desperate, and thick with the heavy influence of expensive scotch. It was Richard's voice. My father flinched as the sound of his own drunken pleading filled the room. The color drained from his face with terrifying speed. The recording captured a phone call Richard made exactly 6 days ago. He had dialed the direct extension of a senior loan officer at my husband's firm. In the audio, Richard begged the executive for an expedited high-interest bridge loan. He sounded frantic, shedding every ounce of his country club dignity. He admitted his personal accounts were overdrawn. He admitted he was drowning in undocumented liabilities. He offered to pledge his entire corporate retirement pension as collateral, just to secure enough liquid cash to survive the month. The voicemail continued playing, broadcasting his profound financial ruin to the entire house. He pleaded for discretion. He begged the loan officer to push the paperwork through before his country club associates discovered he was insolvent. I let the recording play until the final pathetic sigh, followed by the automated click of the disconnected line. The silence that followed was heavy and absolute. The recording dismantled their entire extortion plot in 60 seconds. Richard and Caroline were not wealthy suburban aristocrats protecting their golden son. They were not capable of destroying my husband's firm. The audio exposed the truth. They were complicit, bankrupt accomplices, desperately trying to secure access to my trust fund because they had already destroyed their own financial foundation. I lowered my wrist, my eyes locking onto the hollow, terrified expression of my father. I watched the last remaining pillars of his manufactured empire crumble into dust. The echoes of my father pleading for a high-interest bridge loan faded into the expensive acoustic paneling of the living room. The silence that followed was suffocating. My parents stood frozen by the fireplace. Richard stared at the ceiling speakers as if the audio equipment had just pronounced his death sentence. His jaw hung slack. Caroline pressed her trembling, manicured hands over her mouth, her eyes darting between her husband and me. Their extortion plot, built on empty threats of country club influence and media sabotage, evaporated in less than 60 seconds. They possessed zero leverage. They were bankrupt accomplices clutching the crumbling pillars of a social standing they could no longer afford to maintain. I shifted my gaze away from my parents and looked toward the dining room archway. Preston stood near the edge of the woven rug, watching the destruction of his final shield. His bespoke suit, tailored to project the effortless confidence of a visionary Silicon Valley founder, now hung on his frame like a borrowed costume. He looked across the room at Vanessa. His wife remained standing near the shattered remnants of the Thanksgiving feast. Her posture was rigid, her expression unreadable. She did not offer him a glance of pity or a word of support. Vanessa was a corporate public relations executive. She survived in Manhattan by calculating the precise trajectory of shifting power dynamics. She evaluated her husband, and she saw a toxic liability. Preston watched her eyes turn cold, and he realized no one was coming to save him. Survival instinct in white-collar criminals rarely manifests as physical confrontation. When the legal and financial walls close in, they do not fight, they seek a digital backdoor. Preston backed away from the archway. He let his paralyzed parents absorb my attention. His leather shoes made no sound against the hardwood floor as he retreated down the long, shadowed corridor leading toward the rear of the estate. The calm exterior he maintained for his investors shattered. His breathing turned shallow and rapid. Sweat soaked the collar of his tailored shirt, sticking the expensive fabric to the back of his neck. He needed liquidity. The primary generational trust fund was locked. His platinum credit cards were dead. His startup accounts were likely red-flagged by the ongoing estate audit. His mind raced, scanning the architecture of our grandfather's complex estate planning for a single overlooked vulnerability. He remembered the secondary reserve. Decades ago, our grandfather established an offshore emergency account domiciled in the Cayman Islands. It was designed as a fail-safe, holding a fraction of the total estate capital intended to cover catastrophic geopolitical events or sudden medical crises. It required dual digital authorization to access, meaning it demanded both my signature and his. Because the primary trust attorneys operated out of Manhattan, Preston gambled that their fiduciary freeze had not yet propagated across international borders to the secondary offshore reserve. He theorized that the island banks operated on a delayed weekend processing schedule. If he could route a specific dollar amount before the international security protocols updated, he could secure enough cash to charter a flight, cross a border, and disappear. Preston slipped into Richard's home office and pushed the heavy door shut. The room served as a monument to manufactured prestige. Leather-bound law books that had never been opened lined the polished mahogany shelves. A heavy oak desk dominated the center of the space. Preston bypassed the primary desktop computer. He knew corporate terminals logged keystrokes and required complex biometric authentication that could trigger secondary alerts. Instead, he reached for the family iPad resting on the leather blotter. The tablet served as the central hub for the smart home network. It controlled the climate thermostats, the security cameras, and the integrated audio system. But Preston knew Richard also used it to review digitized legal documents for his country club committee. It contained a cache of unencrypted signatures, including mine saved from previous joint tax filings. He swiped the screen. The device unlocked without requiring a passcode. His hands shook uncontrollably as he navigated to the secure browser. He accessed a proprietary routing portal, a hidden interface he built years ago to funnel money away from the primary trust into his corporate shell companies. The screen cast a pale blue glow across his flushed, sweating face. The silence of the house pressed against his eardrums. He glanced at the closed office door, paranoid that I would walk through it at any second to finalize his ruin. He pulled up the offshore ledger. The reserve account displayed a healthy, untouched balance. Preston exhaled a ragged breath. He believed he found his loophole. He tapped the transfer field. He did not ask for a few $1,000s to cover immediate legal fees. He typed a request for a six-figure sum, routing the capital directly into a decentralized cryptocurrency wallet he maintained under a fictitious corporate entity. It was an untraceable ghost account. Once the funds hit that digital wallet, the money would vanish from the global banking system. The portal requested the final authorization. It required the dual signature verification. Preston opened a secondary tab. He accessed the family document cache. He scrolled frantically through the files until he located a PDF of my signed tax return from 3 years prior. He utilized a screen clipping tool extracting the digital rendering of my signature. He pasted the image into the authorization field of the routing portal. He applied a quick algorithmic filter to blend the pixels, ensuring the digital ink matched the stark white background of the banking interface. It was a crude, desperate forgery, but automated offshore clearinghouses rarely flagged visual discrepancies on weekend evenings. He hovered his trembling index finger over the submit button. He envisioned the cash hitting his crypto wallet. He pictured himself driving to a private airfield, leaving the ruined Thanksgiving dinner, his bankrupt parents and his defecting wife far behind. He pressed the glass screen. The portal processed the command. A spinning gray wheel appeared in the center of the display. Preston leaned closer, his heart hammering against his ribs. The processing icon spun for 3 agonizing seconds. The blue glow of the interface vanished. The screen of the iPad turned a solid, blinding red. Preston blinked, recoiling from the sudden shift in light. He stared at the tablet. The routing portal was gone. In its place, a harsh white typography rendered across the crimson background. It was not a banking decline notice. It was a federal warning banner. The text cited the United States Code for Interstate Wire Fraud and Identity Theft. A secondary line of text indicated that a live packet trace was currently tracking the device's IP address, mapping his exact physical location. A cold draft swept into the room. The heavy oak door of the office swung open. I stepped over the threshold, my heels clicking softly against the woven Persian rug. I did not rush. I walked with the measured, unyielding pace of an auditor arriving to collect a debt. I stopped a few feet away from the desk. Preston looked up from the red screen. His face was devoid of color. His mouth opened, but his vocal cords failed to produce a single sound. "You should have paid closer attention to the network architecture of your own childhood home," I said, my voice echoing in the quiet office. I looked at the glowing red tablet resting on the leather blotter. When I installed the integrated audio system to broadcast our father's voicemail, I did not just sync my watch to the ceiling speakers. I explained, delivering the mechanical reality of his doom. I replaced the operating system on that tablet. The device you are holding is no longer a smart home hub. It is a monitored honeypot. Preston stared at me, his eyes wide with a terror that bypassed logic. He understood the terminology. A honeypot is a decoy server, a digital trap designed to lure hostile actors into committing a breach while recording their every keystroke and tracking their exact methodology. The offshore reserve account you tried to access was flagged and locked by the estate attorneys yesterday afternoon. I continued, my gaze locking onto his panicked eyes. The interface you just navigated was a synthetic simulation. The routing numbers you typed went into a closed loop on a secure server located in Manhattan. I stepped closer, resting my hands on the edge of the oak desk. "But the digital signature you forged was real," I stated, my tone dropping to a lethal whisper. "And the transmission you initiated crossed state lines. By attempting to route those funds to a decentralized wallet using a stolen identity, you committed federal wire fraud. Because that tablet is currently tethered to a monitored corporate server, your intrusion triggered an automated security protocol." Preston looked down at the red screen, watching the packet trace numbers climb higher and higher. The reality of his physical isolation set in. "I did not call the local police, Preston," I informed him. "The local authorities handle noise complaints and property disputes. You just executed a felony financial crime on a monitored network. The automated alert bypassed the municipal precinct. It transmitted your exact coordinates, your forged documents, and your device fingerprint directly to the Federal Bureau of Investigation's Cyber Division." Preston stared at the red federal warning banner illuminating the dark confines of the home office. His cognitive functions stalled. The digital trap closed around him with lethal precision. His fingers went numb. The family tablet slipped from his grasp. The device hit the heavy oak desk with a loud clatter, sliding across the leather blotter before coming to a halt near a stack of unread law books. He looked down at his shaking hands, realizing the invisible ink of his forged signature just sealed his fate. He committed a federal crime on a monitored network. The Cyber Division algorithms were already compiling his digital footprint, mapping his device fingerprint, and tracing the exact geographical coordinates of the colonial estate. The silence inside the study broke. A sound echoed through the sprawling house. It was not the melodic chime of the front doorbell. It was a heavy, rhythmic knock striking the solid wood of the front entryway. The impact carried the weight of unyielding authority. The strikes were spaced out and deliberate, echoing down the long corridor and reverberating against the mahogany shelves. I did not linger to watch my brother hyperventilate in the glow of the red screen. I turned my back on him. I walked out of the office, my heels striking the hardwood floor in a steady metronomic cadence. I passed the living room archway. Richard and Caroline remained standing by the stone fireplace, paralyzed by the audio recording of my father begging for a predatory loan. They heard the heavy knocking. They looked toward the foyer, their eyes wide with creeping dread. The patriarch and the matriarch possessed zero capacity to intervene. Their social leverage was a phantom currency useless against the impending reality waiting on the other side of the door. I reached the entryway. I grasped the brass handle and pulled the heavy oak door open. The cold autumn wind swept into the warm foyer, carrying the scent of fallen leaves and damp earth. Julian stepped across the threshold. My husband did not arrive carrying a bottle of wine or a seasonal greeting. He stood 6 feet 2 inches tall, wearing a pristine, tailored charcoal suit that cut a striking silhouette against the dim lighting of the foyer. The bespoke fabric fell flawlessly over his broad shoulders. He projected an aura of undeniable dominance. He did not look like a suburban relative arriving late for a holiday dinner. He looked like an apex predator stepping into an enclosed pen. His dark eyes scanned the interior of the estate, processing the layout, identifying the targets, and calculating the shifting dynamics of the room in a fraction of a second. He nodded to me a silent acknowledgement of the executed strategy. Vanessa observed the arrival from the edge of the hallway. The corporate public relations executive stood near the ruined dining room, her sharp mind working at a relentless pace. She looked at the imposing figure standing in the foyer. She looked at the panicked parents cowering near the fireplace. Then she looked down the shadowed corridor toward the home office where her husband remained trapped. Vanessa understood the architecture of a collapsing narrative better than anyone in the house. She spent her career mitigating high-profile corporate scandals in Manhattan. She knew the difference between a civil lawsuit and a federal indictment. A civil lawsuit requires a financial settlement. A federal indictment requires a prison sentence. Preston just triggered a digital alert to a government cyber division. He secretly leveraged their marital property using her forged signature. He tethered her pristine professional name to an unrecorded high-interest debt. If she stayed by his side, the ensuing federal investigation would freeze her personal bank accounts. The prosecutors would subpoena her corporate emails. The scandal would bleed into her reputation, destroying the public relations empire she built from the ground up through years of calculated networking. Survival in the corporate sector demands ruthless pragmatism. When a sinking ship begins to take on water, a seasoned executive does not grab a bucket. The executive secures a lifeboat and severs the anchor. Vanessa walked down the corridor. She bypassed the living room and entered the home office. Preston stood near the desk, trembling, his eyes fixated on the red screen of the dropped tablet. He looked up as his wife walked into the room. He expected a lifeline. He expected her to utilize her crisis management skills to draft a statement, find a legal loophole, or spin the narrative to protect their assets. Vanessa stopped a few inches away from him. Her expression was a masterclass in detached execution. She did not raise her voice. She did not shed a single tear. She reached across her left hand. Her fingers grasped the thick platinum band and the flawless 3-carat diamond resting on her ring finger. She pulled the ring over her knuckle. The metal slid off her skin with smooth, frictionless ease. Preston watched the movement, his breath catching in his throat. He tried to speak, to beg her to wait, but the words died before they reached his lips. Vanessa held the diamond ring between her thumb and index finger. She stepped closer, invading his personal space. She reached out and dropped the heavy piece of jewelry directly into the breast pocket of his bespoke tailored shirt. The ring landed with a dull thud, a physical weight resting against his chest, symbolizing the immediate termination of their marital contract. "I am filing for immediate divorce," Vanessa stated. Her voice was quiet and razor-sharp. "My legal counsel will serve you with the separation papers tomorrow morning. I am filing a sworn affidavit with the district attorney regarding your forgery of my signature on the secondary mortgage." Preston shook his head, a pathetic gesture of denial. He reached toward her, his hands shaking uncontrollably. "Do not touch me," Vanessa warned, her tone dropping into a lethal register. "You forged my name to fund a digital fantasy. You committed federal wire fraud on a monitored network. You built a house of cards and you expect me to burn inside. I do not share liabilities. I will not spend a single minute of my life protecting a felon. You are on your own." She turned on her heel and walked out of the office. She did not look back. She navigated the hallway, walked past my paralyzed parents, and approached the foyer. She offered Julian a brief professional nod, acknowledging his authority before stepping out the front door and disappearing into the cold autumn night. Preston stumbled out of the home office a moment later. He looked like a casualty of an invisible war. The diamond ring sat heavy in his shirt pocket. The sweat on his forehead caught the light of the hallway fixtures. He walked toward the foyer, his legs unsteady, drawn toward the remaining figures in the house by a primal need for resolution. He stopped at the edge of the entryway. He looked at me, then shifted his gaze to the imposing man standing by my side. Preston tried to resurrect a fraction of his former arrogance. He tried to square his shoulders, attempting to project the image of a wealthy tech founder defending his territory. He looked at Julian, assuming my husband was merely a ruthless private equity executive arriving to collect a debt on behalf of a shadow lender. "You think you can just walk into my house and foreclose on my life?" Preston sneered, his voice cracking under the strain. "You think buying my debt gives you jurisdiction over my family? I will tie your firm up in litigation for the next decade." Julian did not flinch. He did not offer a polite introduction. He did not extend a hand for a greeting. Men who wield genuine systemic power do not engage in petty suburban arguments. Julian reached inside the breast pocket of his charcoal suit jacket. He did not pull out a business card. He did not retrieve a corporate legal summons. He withdrew a black leather wallet and flipped it open with a swift practice motion. The warm light of the foyer illuminated the heavy solid gold badge pinned to the leather. Preston stared at the shield. The remaining color drained from his face, leaving his skin a sickly, translucent white. Julian lowered the leather wallet. His dark eyes locked onto my brother. "I serve as the Chief Executive Officer of Sterling Mezzanine Partners." Julian stated, his voice a deep, resonant baritone that commanded the space. "But that is my secondary title. My primary career resides within the Department of Justice. I am a former federal prosecutor, and I currently direct a specialized corporate fraud task force operating out of the Southern District of New York." Julian took a deliberate step forward, closing the distance between them. "The private equity firm functions as a sanctioned collection apparatus for the federal government," Julian revealed, dismantling the final illusion of the evening. "We acquire toxic debts from shadow lenders to build undeniable evidence of interstate money laundering. We tracked your unencrypted offshore ledgers 3 weeks ago. We monitored your forged signature. We monitored your wire fraud attempt 10 minutes ago. You are not just a defaulting borrower, Preston. You are the primary target of a multi-agency federal sweep." The gold shield resting in the leather wallet caught the ambient light of the foyer chandelier. The metallic glint severed the final thread of reality, tethering my brother to his fabricated existence. Preston stared at the badge. His cognitive functions stalled as he attempted to process the dual identity standing in his childhood home. He spent his entire adult life treating laws as minor inconveniences and financial regulations as flexible guidelines meant for the lower classes. He assumed my husband was merely another corporate entity, a rival executive he could outmaneuver in a civil courtroom or drown in endless litigation. The realization that he was staring at a federal prosecutor dismantled his mind. He was not facing a lawsuit. He was facing the unyielding machinery of the United States Department of Justice. His eyes darted from the gold badge to Julian's cold expression and then to the open doorway. The cold autumn wind continued to blow through the entryway, rustling the fallen leaves on the concrete steps outside. Vanessa had walked through that door moments ago, severing her marital ties and leaving him to face the impending wreckage alone. The wide-open exit represented his physical freedom, but the digital trap he triggered in the home office meant his geographical coordinates were already locked into a federal monitoring system. He could not outrun a cyber division trace. When a white-collar criminal realizes their intellect can no longer secure their survival, they revert to primal kinetic desperation. They abandon their sophisticated rhetoric and resort to raw physical leverage. Preston did not flee into the night. He lunged forward. He moved with a sudden, erratic burst of adrenaline. He rushed past Julian, his shoulder brushing against the tailored charcoal fabric of my husband's suit. Preston grabbed the heavy brass handle of the solid oak front door. He pulled it inward with all of his remaining strength. The thick wooden door slammed shut with a deafening impact. The sound echoed down the long, shadowed corridor, shaking the expensive artwork hanging on the walls and rattling the crystal pendants on the light fixtures. Preston did not stop there. His hands moved frantically. He twisted the heavy brass deadbolt, the mechanical click sounding like a gunshot in the quiet house. He reached higher and slid the steel chain lock into its groove. He secured the physical barrier, placing his broad back against the wood, effectively sealing the three of us inside the foyer. He stood in front of the exit, his chest heaving under his ruined bespoke shirt. Sweat dripped from his brow, stinging his eyes. He spread his arms wide, planting his leather shoes firmly on the woven entry rug. I was a cornered animal attempting to make himself look larger to deter a predator. He possessed a height advantage over me, and he stood roughly eye to eye with Julian. But his physical presence projected pure terror rather than actual authority. "You are not leaving this house." Preston growled, his voice a ragged, breathless rasp. He pointed a shaking finger at Julian, attempting to initiate a pathetic hostage negotiation. He believed he could barter with a federal agent using the same intimidation tactics he utilized to bully junior developers at his startup. "You are going to take out your phone," Preston demanded, his tone escalating into a shrill register. "You are going to call your cyber division team and tell them the network intrusion was a false alarm. You are going to cancel the trace. And then Vivian is going to log into the estate portal and unlock the generational trust fund. You are going to erase that secondary mortgage, and you are going to wire the cash to my offshore account. Nobody walks out of this front door until my money is secure and my record is wiped clean." I stood a few feet away, watching his psychological collapse. His demands were a laundry list of legal impossibilities. He demanded a federal prosecutor commit obstruction of justice, tamper with digital evidence, and facilitate international money laundering, all in exchange for the privilege of walking out of a suburban Connecticut home. He genuinely believed his physical proximity and his raised voice granted him the power to override a federal mandate. In the adjoining living room, Richard and Caroline remained frozen by the stone fireplace. The patriarch of the family took a hesitant step forward, his eyes wide with horror as he watched his son execute a new, infinitely more dangerous crime. Richard understood the legal threshold Preston just crossed. This was no longer a matter of hidden debts or forged signatures. By locking the door and threatening a federal officer, Preston was committing false imprisonment. He was adding decades to his inevitable prison sentence in real time. Caroline grabbed Richard by the sleeve of his sweater, digging her manicured nails into the fabric, pulling him back into the shadows. They possessed zero capacity to intervene. They built this monster. They spent 30 years paying his debts, covering his failures, and teaching him that the world would always bend to his specific demands. Now they were forced to watch him attempt to bully the federal government, and they lacked the courage to step into the crossfire. Julian did not react to the physical threat. He did not adopt a fighting stance. He did not reach inside his jacket for a weapon. He treated the hostage situation with the exact same mild irritation one might reserve for a delayed flight or a spilled cup of coffee. My husband stood perfectly still in the center of the foyer. The ambient light highlighted the sharp, unyielding angles of his jaw. He looked at Preston, analyzing the frantic breathing, the sweating brow, and the shaking hands. Julian recognized the posture of a broken man attempting to hold together a shattered reality. Julian calmly raised his hands. He did not raise them in surrender. He brought them to his wrists. He adjusted the silver cufflinks, securing the sleeves of his tailored shirt, ensuring the fabric laid flat beneath his charcoal jacket. He smoothed the lapels of his suit, a mundane, deliberate action designed to communicate absolute dominance. "You seem to labor under a severe misconception regarding my presence here tonight," Julian stated. His voice was measured, lacking any fluctuation in volume or pitch. Julian took a slow, calculated step forward. Preston flinched, pressing his spine harder against the solid oak door, the brass chain rattling against the wood. "You believe you are negotiating a business transaction," Julian continued, his dark eyes locking onto my brother. "You believe you can leverage physical confinement to secure a favorable exit strategy. You are attempting to dictate terms to a federal officer while actively committing the crime of unlawful detainment. You are not a chief executive officer holding court in a boardroom, Preston. You are a suspect experiencing a panic attack in a hallway." Preston swallowed hard, his throat dry. He kept his arms spread wide, but his muscles trembled with exhaustion. He tried to reiterate his demands, telling Julian that he would not face the consequences of the wire fraud alone, insisting that he would drag the entire family down with him if the investigation proceeded. "I did not travel to Connecticut in a personal capacity," Julian clarified, ignoring the hollow threats. "I did not come to this estate to carve a turkey, partake in a holiday dinner, or listen to you attempt to extort my wife." Julian reached into the inner breast pocket of his charcoal jacket. Preston tensed, bracing himself for a physical confrontation, expecting my husband to produce a firearm or a pair of steel handcuffs. Julian retrieved a thick folded document printed on heavy textured legal paper. He snapped his wrist, unfolding the pages with a crisp sound that echoed through the quiet foyer. He held the document out, presenting it to the man blocking the exit. The paper bore the official seal of the United States District Court. The text was dense, authoritative, and fatal. "This is a federal search and seizure warrant." Julian announced, his voice carrying the undeniable weight of the justice system. "It was signed by a federal magistrate 3 hours ago. It grants my task force the legal authority to enter this property, secure all digital hardware, and seize any assets tied to your fraudulent holding companies." Julian lowered the document, his gaze piercing through my brother's fading defiance. "You believe you trapped me inside this house by locking the front door," Julian said, shaking his head with a cold, analytical pity. "You did not trap me. You isolated yourself. You might want to step away from the wood and look out the front windows." A tactical unit from the cyber division arrived 5 minutes ago. They are already establishing a perimeter outside this property, and they do not knock twice. Preston kept his spine pressed against the heavy oak wood of the front door. He expected Julian to issue a command or attempt to physically subdue him. He expected a struggle. Instead, my husband simply adjusted his cuffs and offered a piece of advice regarding the front windows. Preston turned his head, his cheeks smearing sweat against the polished brass of the deadbolt. He looked through the narrow glass sidelights flanking the entryway. The darkness of the suburban street was gone. A chaotic, strobing pattern of red and blue light washed over the manicured front lawn. The intense glare pierced through the plantation shutters, casting long, rotating shadows across the walls of the foyer. The rhythmic sweep of the emergency lights painted my brother's pale face in alternating flashes of crimson and cobalt. The heavy crunch of thick rubber tires rolling over the gravel driveway echoed through the quiet neighborhood. Multiple dark sport utility vehicles had parked at precise, calculated angles, blocking the exit routes and boxing in the estate. Preston realized the hostage negotiation was a delusion. He possessed zero leverage. He had locked the front door to trap a federal prosecutor inside, unaware that a government task force was already tightening a net around the entire property. The breach did not happen at the fortified front entryway. Federal agents do not waste time arguing with a locked deadbolt when a residential property offers multiple points of entry. A sharp kinetic impact echoed from the rear of the house. The sound of shattering glass and splintering wood resonated from the kitchen. The heavy sliding patio doors, which looked out over the heated swimming pool, were forced open with calculated, undeniable force. Heavy tactical boots struck the ceramic floor tiles of the kitchen. The footfalls were synchronized, moving with a fast, clinical precision. There was no shouting. There was no chaotic scrambling. The federal agents operated in an eerie, focused silence, utilizing hand signals and spatial awareness to dominate the environment. They flooded the ground floor, their dark tactical gear absorbing the ambient light of the chandelier. The bold yellow letters spelling out the name of their agency across their ballistic vests served as the only introduction they needed. The tactical unit fanned out, securing the perimeter room by room. 2 agents entered the living room. Richard and Caroline were still standing near the stone fireplace, paralyzed by the sudden invasion. An agent pointed a gloved hand toward the plush designer sofas, issuing a crisp, unyielding command for my parents to sit down and keep their hands visible. The patriarch and the matriarch obeyed instantly. They collapsed onto the expensive upholstery. They were no longer the elite hosts of a Thanksgiving gala. They were isolated subjects in an active federal raid, stripped of their country club dignity, forced to watch strangers dismantle their sanctuary. 3 agents marched down the central corridor, heading straight for the foyer. Preston saw them approaching. His brief fantasy of physical resistance evaporated. He raised his hands, peeling his back away from the oak door. He did not say a word. The lead tactical agent grabbed Preston by the shoulder of his bespoke suit, spinning him around with practiced efficiency. The agent patted him down for concealed weapons, confiscated his mobile phone, and pulled him away from the exit. Julian stepped forward, merging with the advancing tactical unit. My husband did not need to issue verbal instructions. The lead agent handed Julian a preliminary status report with a quick nod, confirming the perimeter was locked and the occupants were isolated. "We require the primary target in the study," Julian stated, his voice a low, resonant baritone. The agents flanked my brother. They guided Preston away from the foyer, marching him back down the long hallway. I followed a few paces behind them, maintaining my measured, evaluating pace. We entered the home office. The room still smelled of stale panic. The family tablet lay abandoned on the leather desk blotter, the screen still glowing with the crimson federal warning banner tracking the failed wire fraud attempt. The lead agent ignored the digital tablet. He knew the cyber division was already extracting the data packets remotely. They were hunting physical analog evidence. White-collar criminals always keep a tangible ledger of their most damning transactions and insurance policy tucked away in the dark. The agent bypassed the heavy oak desk and walked toward the far wall of the study. A large oil canvas hung in the center of the wood paneling. It was a high-quality replica of a Renaissance maritime battle depicting war galleons locked in combat. Caroline had purchased the artwork years ago at a charity auction, boasting about its aesthetic value. The agent did not admire the brushstrokes. He reached out, gripped the ornate gilded frame with both hands, and lifted the canvas off its heavy brass mounting hooks. He set the painting carefully on the floor, leaning it against the baseboards. The removal of the artwork revealed a flush steel panel embedded directly into the drywall. It was a high-tier biometric and alphanumeric wall safe. The vault featured a thick tungsten carbide door designed to withstand extreme thermal heat and kinetic drilling. Preston watched the agent expose the hidden safe. A subtle shift occurred in his posture. The sheer blinding panic began to recede, replaced by a desperate, calculating defiance. He straightened his spine, pulling his shoulders back. He crossed his arms over his chest. He looked at the steel door, and then he looked at Julian. The lead agent turned toward my brother, gesturing to the numerical keypad glowing on the front of the vault. "Input the combination," the agent ordered, his tone flat and expectant. Preston pressed his lips together, forming a tight, arrogant line. He knew the parameters of a standard federal search warrant. The document granted the government the right to search the premises and seize assets. It did not grant them the ability to magically bypass encrypted hardware. If a suspect refused to open a high-security vault, the agents were forced to call in a specialized forensic locksmith. Preston calculated the logistics in his head. Drilling through a tungsten carbide door requires heavy specialized industrial equipment. It takes hours of meticulous grinding labor to breach the locking mechanism without destroying the internal contents. He believed those hours were his final lifeline. He believed a delay would afford him the time to invoke his right to counsel, summon his expensive defense attorneys, and drag the search into a bureaucratic legal battle before the sun came up. "I invoke my Fifth Amendment right against self-incrimination," Preston declared, his voice regaining a fraction of its familiar condescending edge. "I will not provide the code. I want my lawyer present before you touch that safe. You can spend the next 6 hours trying to drill through that steel, but you are getting nothing from me tonight." He offered a smug, challenging smirk, banking on the physical limitations of the vault to halt the momentum of the raid. Julian did not argue with him. My husband simply stepped back, yielding the floor. I walked into the center of the study, my heels clicking sharply against the woven rug. I stopped right next to the exposed wall safe. I looked at the glowing digital keypad, and then I turned my head to look at my brother. "You spend too much time calculating the limits of federal law enforcement," I noted, keeping my voice cold and surgical. "And you spend far too little time analyzing your own vulnerability." Preston frowned, the smug smirk faltering as he watched me approach the vault. "In the corporate acquisition sector, we do not wait for a crisis to detonate before we gather our intelligence," I explained, delivering the methodology of his ruin. "We build the surveillance infrastructure long before the target realizes they are being hunted." I raised my right hand, extending my index finger toward the glowing keypad. 3 months ago, I noticed the discrepancies in the trust fund quarterly reports. I continued, my gaze locking onto his widening eyes. "I knew your tech startup was bleeding capital, and I knew your desperation would eventually force you to rely on the physical ledgers hidden in this room. I did not confront you. I did not warn you." I pressed the first digit on the keypad. A sharp electronic beep echoed in the quiet office. "Instead, I hired a private security firm based out of Manhattan," I revealed, spelling out the exact nature of the trap. "They specialize in corporate espionage and internal asset protection. I dispatched a technician to this house under the guise of an annual HVAC maintenance inspection. While my parents were having lunch at the country club, the technician embedded microscopic surveillance lenses directly into the crown molding above that desk." I pressed the second and third digits in rapid succession. Beep, beep. Preston took a staggering step backward. His chest heaved as the reality of the invasive surveillance crushed his final defense. "The lenses possess high-definition optical zoom and infrared capabilities," I stated, pressing the fourth and fifth numbers. "The feed routes directly to a secure server on my personal network. I did not need to guess your passcode, Preston. I have watched you stand in this exact spot, punching in this exact alphanumeric sequence dozens of times over the past 90 days. You handed me the keys to your own destruction." I pressed the final digit. The keypad emitted a long, high-pitched chime. A bright green LED light illuminated across the top of the steel panel. The heavy internal locking bolts retracted with a loud mechanical clank. I reached out, hooked my fingers under the steel handle, and pulled. The heavy tungsten carbide door swung outward on its oiled hinges, gliding open with effortless silence. The lengthy physical drilling process Preston banked his freedom on was bypassed in 10 seconds. The vault was breached. The interior shadows were exposed to the bright lights of the home office, revealing the dark secrets he and our parents had buried inside. A faint scent of stagnant air and old paper drifted into the bright light of the home office. The physical barrier Preston banked his freedom on was neutralized in seconds, leaving him standing in the center of the room with a hollow, vacant expression. The arrogant tech founder posture evaporated. He looked at the open vault, his chest rising and falling in shallow, rapid breaths, watching his digital empire crumble into analog ruin. The lead tactical agent stepped forward, displacing me from the front of the safe. Federal protocols dictate a precise chain of custody during a search and seizure operation. The agent reached into the steel cavity, wearing dark nitrile gloves, ensuring the forensic integrity of the evidence remained pristine. He extracted the primary targets of the raid first. The agent pulled out a stack of thick, leather-bound ledgers and a series of encrypted hardware wallets resting on the bottom steel shelf. These were not standard accounting books. White-collar criminals who operate offshore cryptocurrency laundering rings often keep a physical, localized backup of their digital keys, terrified that a cloud server wipe could erase their wealth. The ledgers contained the raw, unredacted transaction hashes. They held the routing numbers for the shell companies in the Cayman Islands. They documented the exact trajectory of the capital Preston siphoned from the generational trust fund. Julian stepped closer, his dark eyes scanning the recovered items. The former federal prosecutor recognized the undeniable weight of the evidence. He looked at Preston, offering a cold, analytical assessment of the man standing before him. The physical ledgers meant the cyber division did not even need to crack the network encryption. Preston had meticulously documented his own guilt and locked it inside a wall safe, wrapping a neat bow around his inevitable prison sentence. But the vault held more than just the architectural blueprints of a corporate fraud scheme. The tactical agent reached deeper into the recessed cavity. He pulled out a stack of dark blue velvet jewelry boxes. The velvet was worn at the corners, bearing the distinct faded insignia of a historic Parisian jeweler. The boxes did not belong to Preston. They possessed an aesthetic history that predated his tech startup by decades. The agent placed the velvet boxes on the leather blotter of the oak desk, resting them right next to the confiscated ledgers. He popped the hinged lid of the top box open to inspect the contents for contraband. The bright overhead lights caught the flawless facets of a heavy emerald pendant surrounded by crushed diamonds. I stepped toward the desk, my eyes locking onto the jewelry. I recognized the emerald instantly. I recognized the platinum setting and the intricate filigree work on the chain. I reached out, hovering my hand over the velvet without touching the evidence. I turned my head and looked down the hallway. Caroline and Richard had been ordered to remain seated in the living room under the supervision of a tactical agent. But the sharp mechanical clank of the tungsten carbide door retracting echoed throughout the colonial estate. The sound functioned as a psychological trigger. Caroline knew exactly what resided in the shadows of that specific vault. The matriarch ignored the commands of the agent guarding her. She pushed herself off the plush designer sofa, her designer heels clicking frantically against the hardwood floor as she rushed down the corridor. She reached the threshold of the home office just as the tactical agent opened the first velvet box. Caroline stopped in the doorway. The color drained from her face, leaving her skin a stark, pallid white. She stared at the emerald pendant resting on the desk, her pristine suburban facade fracturing into a million irreparable pieces. "That emerald belonged to our late grandmother," I stated, my voice projecting clearly across the room, ensuring the federal agents understood the context of the discovery. "My grandfather commissioned the piece in Europe 50 years ago. It was the centerpiece of a vast estate collection, a collection designated to be divided equally among the grandchildren upon her passing." I looked at my mother. Her chest heaved. Her manicured hands trembled at her sides. 7 years ago, Caroline claimed the estate was targeted in a coordinated home invasion. I continued dissecting the lie she maintained for nearly a decade. She told the family that thieves bypassed the alarm system while they were attending a charity gala. She claimed the burglars stripped the master bedroom, taking the entire heirloom jewelry collection. She wept at the dining table. She filed a comprehensive police report. I shifted my gaze back to the velvet boxes resting on the leather blotter. She also filed a 7-figure claim with the insurance underwriters. I revealed, outlining the exact mechanics of her deception. She collected a significant payout for the stolen artifacts. She used that untraceable cash to fund her extravagant country club renovations and her seasonal wardrobe upgrades.